Great. So nice to see everyone this morning. My name is Todd Rose, and I'm the director of the Mind, Brain, and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And my focus of work is on individuality and personalization. And I get the privilege of speaking to you about my new book called The End of Average. And I think most of us, for education, most of us are here because we feel like probably the current industrial system isn't quite doing what we need it to do anymore. And while there's lots of debates about what the system should be like, I think we all agree that the future has to be some kind of more personalized system, something capable of nurturing potential instead of just batch processing it. And obviously I agree, and I wrote this book, The End of Average, because I think that the main barrier right now that we face to getting to personalization at scale is actually a mindset, and it's this continued belief in what I call the myth of the average person. So I want to use my time today to draw from a handful of examples from my book and do two things. One is show you what I mean when I say there's no such thing as an average person, and then show you what we might put in its place, a principled way of thinking about individuality that can serve as a foundation for personalized learning at scale. So when I say there's no average person, let me tell you the first time that I encountered this idea of the myth of average. It was in 2002, I was being trained in brain imaging at Mass General Hospital as part of my doctoral work. And if you would have been in one of my studies back then, it would work something like this. You would all come in individually. I would put you in a scanner. I would give you some kind of task, scan your brain, get a pattern, and then I would automatically average together all your brains. And then I would publish an average brain map. And that's pretty common for most of imaging and most of science, frankly. So that's how we were learning. We were dutifully being trained in this approach. And then a paper appeared by a colleague of mine, Mike Miller, out of UC Santa Barbara, that really rocked our field. And it was such a simple paper at first. All he was doing was studying the basic idea of how your brain retrieves memory. And I say basic because, not that it's simple, but that we really know, or we thought we knew, the brain areas that were involved in doing this task. So Mike did the study, he did the common method, and he averaged it out, and he produced an average brain map. And this is actually the map from Mike Miller's study. You'll have to trust me that it looks just like the average brain that anybody else has published. But Mike did one more thing that will seem intuitive maybe to you guys, but wasn't to us at the time. He just asked a basic question. Out of all the individuals in my study, how many of their brains were actually anything like the average brain map that had been derived from these people? So let me show you just a handful of these from his study. These were all people that had done the task well, right? So there weren't performance differences. Here was one person's brain. Here's another, and another. And I just used 3 to show you. I could have picked any brain in that study because it turned out there wasn't a single one of them that looked anything like the average. So actually, Mike got worried. Maybe you've done something wrong. So to his everlasting credit, 6 months later, he doesn't publish anything. 6 months later, he decides to bring people back. And he puts them in the same scanner, and he gives them the same exact task. And he gets the same result. The average represented nobody at all. But what was really great is that each individual's brain, that pattern, was very stable from time 1 to time 2. So it turned out the way individual brains process things were unique and related to different kinds of strategies that they would use to do this. Now, Mike was the first to show us there's no such thing as an average brain, but it turns out that it's not unique to neuroscience. In every field where we've looked, we've found the exact same thing. It turns out there's no such thing as an average cell. There's no such thing as average cancer. There's no such thing as the average genome. There's no such thing as average behavior, learning, and on and on. And what I think is the most important lesson to learn for education today, we know for sure there's no such thing as an average student. Now, I actually think that that's probably not that controversial, but even if you accept for a moment that that's true, right, you can kind of quickly see what the problem might be then, because we really have built our core industrial model of education on the assumption explicitly that the average was useful for thinking about kids and potential. So if you think about it, even today, we design textbooks to be what we call age appropriate, which sounds really good, except for it just means what does the average kid of that age know and can do, right? We will give standardized assessments that will compare kids one-dimensionally to a hypothetical average student, right? We'll even fix the pace of learning and the sequence with which you're going to learn based on what we know about learning and development on average, right? And the thing is, it's not accidental. The current system we have was built by people who were absolutely obsessed with averages because averages had worked so well in how we manage factories. When you could treat people as interchangeable cogs, it works really well. But it's not that big of a stretch to say, no matter what the benefits of an average-based system were back then, we want something different, right? We really feel like whatever else it is, we want a system that's capable of nurturing potential instead of batch processing it, developing talent instead of just sorting it. And again, this sounds great, but if we want to be able to do that, then we have to recognize that average-based systems simply don't work. They really aren't built for that. Now, that would be a depressing kind of story if that was the end. It's like, what we have doesn't work. So the good news, right? There is good news, that we do actually have a different approach to thinking about individuals. So I've been part of this science for the last 2 decades. Well, not me. I was still a student 2 decades ago, but of this thing called the science of the individual. And at its core, the approach to the science of the individual is exactly what it sounds like. It's getting beyond group averages and looking for patterns of individuality. And this basic approach to science has been at the forefront of major breakthroughs in everything from cancer research and cell biology to things like human nutrition and even infant development, right? And what makes me excited about this, and the reason I wrote the book, is I believe that this science gives us a principled way to think about individuality in the context of education that would allow us to get to personalized learning at scale. So I want to use the rest of my time to introduce you to what I see as 3 principles of individuality that are derived from this science: jaggedness, context, and pathways. And just kind of show you how I think, again, this could be a good foundation for personalized learning. So I think you'll find, hopefully, that each one of these principles will seem like really intuitive, like you need science for this, but it's just not how we've thought about things in the past. So the first principle is called the Jaggedness Principle, and in its simplest form, it's this: all human characteristics that we care about are multidimensional and can never be reduced to a single score, ever, right? And the first time that we actually encountered the Jaggedness Principle actually goes back about over 60 years ago, and it had to do with the first time we realized that there was no such thing as an average-sized person. And it started with the United States Air Force. It was coming off of World War II. We'd just gone from propeller airplanes to jet-powered aviation, right? And we'd invested so much money in this new technology with the thinking that, hey, look, we're going to have better performance, we're going to have this great Air Force. But actually, we were getting the exact opposite result. So we were supposed to have these great pilots, but they were have worse performance, and people were really struggling with, like, why? Why are they having such trouble? So we went through a cycle of, first we thought, well, maybe the pilots were to blame. Like, literally a general said, this generation doesn't have the right stuff. Like, this was, and then they realized there were like World War II aces that were also having problems. So then they blamed flight instructors, like, you're not teaching them well. And then it turned out after reinventing flight instruction, that didn't really work. And ultimately they figured out what the problem was. And it was actually the design of the cockpit itself. Here's what I mean. So the problem with designing a cockpit, just like designing most things, if you want scale, you only get to design one, right? And you got to figure out, how would you design it to accommodate a wide range of body sizes, right? The widest range possible. So in the military, all the way back to the Civil War, the guiding design philosophy had been to design for the average size soldier. So what they would do, and what they did the first time they designed the cockpit in 1921, they literally just took the average of 10 dimensions of size that matter for cockpits of the soldiers that existed and said, okay, design a cockpit for that, under the assumption that it should accommodate most people. And it sort of is almost kind of intuitive that that could be true. But anyway, so what they figured out was, wait a minute, it's 1950, we've probably gotten bigger. That was the thinking. We're bigger soldiers, bigger pilots. So they commissioned what was then the largest study of military body size in history. And they went and studied over 4,000 pilots, who, by the way, were all selected. They were like white male and selected because they fit into an average size cockpit to begin with, right? And they said, let's get an updated average, right? So they hired this guy who's my favorite person. I got the pleasure for my book to interview him. He's in his 90s. Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels. He was 23 at the time. He had no background in the Air Force, but he had studied physical anthropology, so he knew about body size. So they said, your job is to take the tape measure and measure 147 dimensions of size on all these pilots flying around. So that was his job. But he figured out, he said, I'll do this, but I don't think that's the problem. He said, I actually think there's something wrong with the concept of average. And of course they were like, that's ridiculous, right? And who are you to say that? And so he got permission. He said, look, on the side, can I do this study separate from the one I'm doing? Can I just ask, how many of the pilots that we have are actually average on like the 10 core dimensions of size for cockpits? And they said, fine, we already know the answer, but go ahead if you want to do it in your spare time, right? So he does the work, and then what he finds? Zero. Not a single pilot was actually average on 10 dimensions of size. And it gets worse or better, depending on your view. If you just took 3 dimensions of size, like height and chest circumference and torso length, less than 4% of them were average on those dimensions. So Gilbert Daniels figures out there's no average pilot. And so if you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it to fit nobody. But what's really important is what he did find. The reason there was no average pilot is that every single pilot that was studied had what we call a jagged profile. If you map out dimensions of size, you can be high on one end, you can be in the middle on some, and you can be on the low end. Every single pilot. It's because these dimensions don't correlate as highly with each other as we would think. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest person. What's really interesting about this, once you accept jaggedness as a core thing, which, by the way, as an aside, this is actual data from Gilbert Daniels. Obviously, the pictures aren't from the videos. But if you average together their dimensions, they're the exact same. So they're the same size, these two guys. But this kind of brings us to a kind of simple question. If you realize jaggedness is the rule, if I said, which person is bigger? It feels like there should be an easy answer there, right? But in fact, there isn't. Bigger isn't a thing when it comes to size, because size is not one-dimensional, right? And so the thing is that it'd be great if it was just about size, that's nice, but it turns out that this idea of jaggedness is true for all human characteristics that we really care about, whether it's character itself, whether it's ability, potential, or even intelligence. So here are 2 women. These are real scores from an adult intelligence test with all the subscores, right? Both these women have a score of 103 on average, so they're the same intelligence, right? Now, of course, if we don't care to know them, maybe 103 is good enough, right? But if our job suddenly becomes, how do we nurture their potential, it really matters that one of them is good at visual kinds of stuff and maybe not so good at verbal, and vice versa, right? If our job is to actually nurture their potential, you have to understand the jagged pattern that is the basis for individuality. Okay, so we're all jagged, and you can never reduce people to a single score, whether you're talking about body size or ability. And of course, as an aside, we do this all the time in education, right? The second principle, we take our jaggedness, is that it's the context principle, and simply stated, it's that it is meaningless to talk about behavior, ability, learning, independent of the environment in which it's occurring. Now, I will say, when I talk to educators, nobody thinks that's controversial. The situation matters, the relationships matter, the space matters. And yet, in psychology, we ignore context as much as possible, right? We want decontextualized personality tests and things like that. But I think it's not controversial to say context matters. So I think, why is it that we've really not dealt with that in a serious way in education, right? And I think it's this, that when we think about taking context seriously, even when we know it matters, it feels like it's going to be chaotic and complex and super hard, right? But here's what's really cool. In the sciences, we found the opposite, that when you take context seriously, it often simplifies and clarifies where average is obscured. And I'll give you an example by telling you what is one of my favorite studies. How many of you are familiar with the Stamping Reflex? So it's this. When infants are born, if you put them upright, their legs will start doing this. And it looks like they can walk, right? Super cute, right? I had my first kid, I literally did this when he was like 1 month old. I thought he was a genius. Like, I swear to you, I was like, wow. I called my mom, who's a nurse. I said, he's going to be like a super athlete, right? And she said, hey, he's not walking. It's called the stamping reflex. Don't worry, it'll go away, right? She's very encouraging. And I said, wait, go away, right? And so it turns out this is true. The stamping reflex, kids are born, it goes away around 2 months, and it comes back right before they learn to walk. And this had puzzled scientists for a very long time, right? Why would a reflex go away? So using average-based approaches in the 60s, scientists had landed on an explanation, which was brain maturation. That motor areas of the brain myelinated, they suppressed this reflex, it came back under voluntary control. That was what we thought the answer was until Esther Thalin, who was a pioneer in this new science out of Indiana, she said, this is not quite right. Let's look at kids' jaggedness in terms of body size, put them in different contexts. She put them on treadmills, she put them in water, and she found out that it had nothing to do with the brain. Her answer, chubby thighs. Little kids about 2 months of age get a burst of subcutaneous fat, and it's just their legs are just too heavy. They can't lift them when you hold them up. That's it. So I promise you, chubby thighs has never appeared in the history of the annals of science anywhere, right? But what's really important about this is when we thought it was brain maturation, if your kid didn't lose its stepping reflex by 2 months, it meant you had some brain delays. And we sent kids for remediation. And by the way, we had like a 99% success rate at remediating them, right? Which then just feeds back into the cycle of, look how smart we are, right? We really got this nailed. So trust me when I say sometimes taking context seriously actually simplifies and clarifies. It doesn't necessarily make it more complicated. The third principle is what we call the pathways principle. And simply stated, it is that people differ naturally in the pace and the sequence with which they achieve success. And as a result, there is always more than one pathway to an outcome. Always, right? That's not controversial in science, but if you think about our education system, it is the exact opposite of what we've assumed. We view learning and development as more like a ladder, right? There's one path, and there's rungs on this thing, and the only way you can differ is how fast you move up those rungs. And make no mistake, we absolutely assume that fast equals smart. Right? That's built into the whole system. If I say you're a quick learn, you think I just said you're smart, right? So it turns out when we got away from looking at group averages and started studying how individuals learn, there is absolutely no relationship between pace and ability. That was really hard for me personally. I thought for sure there must be at least a little bit of a relationship if you're faster, right? I would have even said I thought I was a fast learner. So it was very hard for me, right? But it turns out there just isn't the correlation. It's unbelievable. And our whole system was based on like one study that Edward Thorndike did, right? Looking at correlation between pace and ability. And have you ever thought about this, like, where do we come up with how much time we give kids to take a standardized test? Or how much time they get to learn? More often than not, it's actually based on the average time it took of a representative sample to finish, under the assumption that if you're slower than average, you're not smart enough to use the extra time anyway. It's like, so what's really cool, and this is not rocket science, nor is it brand new. Benjamin Bloom knew this a long time ago, right? So we'll give credit where credit's due. This is some original data from Bloom. I just picked 5 kids to show you, to illustrate this. But this has been shown over and over. Sal Khan has spoken eloquently of this in his TED Talk about what he saw, the same kinds of things. Here's 5 kids that were in a self-paced learning environment that also had a control group that was based around class schedule, fixed time. Total amount of time the kids had were the exact same. Just one group got to move at their own pace within that allotted amount of time. This was the time when the class exam happened, which is actually arbitrary, right? Like, when do we decide to cut off, say, stop the clock, give the test? This poor little kid at the bottom, he's really struggling, right? He clearly doesn't understand, except for he happened to be in the self-paced group, right? You get a little more time, and he ends up the best in the class. This is not a one-off thing. This is probably the most replicated finding we have when it comes to looking at mastery learning. It turns out if you give a little bit of flexibility, what one kid can do, most kids can do. But that's a terrible way. You think about the consequences of what this means. When you fix the amount of time kids have, we just destroy talent across the board, right? We make kids into looking like they don't understand, but it's just a coincidence of time for this. And maybe it was one thing when we couldn't do anything else about it. And I'm not saying we can give every kid a year to learn something that takes some kids a week, but we can certainly do more than everyone learns at the exact same fixed pace. So we have a science. I think these basic principles give us a better foundation for thinking about what it means to personalize learning at scale, right? It's not that every kid's a snowflake. It's that you can look at systematic ways kids vary and design for that. So I have to say, as a scientist, I actually naively believed that if you had the data, that would be good enough, right? That sort of being right was good enough. You know, it is naive, I'll admit. And then you start studying social movements and change, and you realize it almost has nothing to do with being right. Like, you actually have to move people. So I actually wrote the book, and I started a nonprofit to catalyze mass social movement around this idea, based on one last story I want to share with you that kind of shook me and made me realize, again, being right's not good enough. Because it turns out that the Air Force was not the first organization to figure out there's no such thing as an average-sized person. 7 years before that, in the 1940s, the head of the American Gynecological Association, Robert Dickinson, decided he wanted to create a statue for all physicians and educators that represented the ideal, typical American woman. So he got body size, like everything from even toe length, on 18,000 women in the US, and he created a sculpture. And not surprisingly, he called it Norma, because it was normal, average was normal. And they created it, and I just want to show you, as disturbing as this is Norma. It kicked off a ridiculous craze all over the United States. Like, she was literally on talk shows. She didn't have much to say, but she was on talk shows, right? And people were so obsessed with it. They actually had a national Norma lookalike contest, where in the papers they said, women, send in your dimensions on these dimensions of size. Tell us how your scores on these 9 dimensions. We'll pick a winner. You'll get a $100 war bond. They were so convinced that there would be thousands of women who were Norma that they had elaborate rules for how you were going to decide randomly who got the war bond. Except for, you had thousands upon thousands of women submitted their dimensions. And these are women who thought they were probably Norma, right? Not a single one was average on 9 dimensions of size. In fact, the winner, Martha Skidmore, was average on 3 of them. So you might think this would have been the end of thinking that this is what American women look like. Except for Bruno Gebhardt, the head of the Cleveland Health Museum, who had sponsored the study, went in the paper and said, I know what the problem is. American women are profoundly unfit. And he said, it's exercise is the answer. And I'm not kidding you, they created miniature replicas of Norma and sent them around to high schools and had exercise programs for young women tailored to how far they differed from Norma on different dimensions. We have one of the miniature replicas at the Harvard Medical School. It's like so disturbing, it's not even funny, right? So this all brings me back to thinking, okay, look, if here we are today, we've got a need for more personalized learning experiences. We actually have a science. We actually have technology that we could use to facilitate better interactions and more personalized experiences. So on the one hand, you could think, well, good, so we're just going to get there. Right? But I think if the Norma story is any guide, it's just not good enough, right? The data doesn't speak for itself. The interpretation really matters. And so in my mind, even though we have the science and we have the technology to get to personalization at scale, that technology is not going to be enough if we continue to see ourselves and the people around us through the lens of averages and deviation from average. But the good news is I think we can get somewhere really special, but it starts with shifting this mindset and starting to see people as individuals. Thank you very much.